Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar on non-response follow-up and local outreach. I hope you all are staying safe and healthy during this difficult time. And happy Census Day. As you know, Asian Americans Advancing Justice is working to ensure a full and accurate count of our communities in the 2020 census. As a national hub, we're working to develop curriculum and materials to support your Get Out the Count work, including fact sheets, toolkits, webinars, social media graphics, translated materials, and more. Today, we're excited to dive deeper into the changing non-response follow-up operations, how local organizations on the ground are adapting their outreach plans in the midst of COVID-19, and how to identify census enumerators. As you may know, this webinar is the 17th installment of our monthly census webinar series, which we launched in August 2018. If you missed our previous webinars and want to tune in, you can access them with the links on this next slide. Next slide, please. Check out our census website at countusin2020.org for all of our webinars and accompanying summary blogs. The website also hosts our toolkit, fact sheets, partner resources, and more. And we have launched a new COVID-19 page with the latest information on changing Census Bureau operations and updated field guidance. You can find information on Census Bureau operations and the latest changes announced, translated on the different language pages that we have under the main resources page. And those are located at countusin2020.org/resources. Next slide. If you have any questions, Advancing Justice AHAC and API Vote are ready to take your census questions. Call our hotline at 844-2020-API or 844-202-0274 for answers to your questions in English and other Asian languages. This hotline is strictly for answering questions regarding the census, such as how can I fill out the census online, or what languages is the paper form available in. This hotline is not meant for filling out the census. If you wish to fill out the census on the phone, please call the Census Bureau's Questionnaire Census phone lines. Next slide. Without further ado, I want to turn it over to our speakers. We are joined by our colleagues at Asian Americans Advancing Justice ALC in San Francisco, Chinese American Planning Council in New York, Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, which works nationally, and Asian Counseling and Referral Service in Washington. We will have Q&A at the end of this webinar, and you can use the chat box or the questions box to send your questions or raise your hand to have your line unmuted so you can ask the questions yourself. If you have questions during the presentation, please also use the chat box or questions box to send us your questions. This webinar is recorded and we will send out the recording and presentation after the webinar. And when we start Q&A, we will repeat these instructions again. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Anne.
Thanks so much, Bessie. So again, my name is Anne Le, and I am with Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. So I believe that when we started doing the census outreach work, we knew that this was going to be challenging because of the threat of the citizenship question being added on to the form and the online transition. I don't think that any of us anticipated that we would be impacted by a pandemic scare. But yes, today is Census Day, so happy Census Day. And I think that we're still all very committed to making sure that we get an accurate count. But despite our best efforts, we are going to have some serious limitations as a result of shelter-in-place policies to limit the spread of COVID-19. This is clearly and obviously going to have a negative impact on our ability to implement the outreach and community education plans to reach historically undercounted Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. So the reality is that we should anticipate low response rates all around. So how do we minimize that, and how can we prepare our communities for the Census Bureau non-response follow-up operations? So when you look at the next slide, you'll see that I actually included the current timeline that the Census Bureau recently put out. Basically, a lot of the operations have been delayed or pushed out for or extended for another 2 weeks. So the self-response phase was supposed to end on July 31st, and now it's ending August 14th. So all of the operations are for self-response and non-response follow-up period will end August 14th. The mobile questionnaire assistance operations, which were set to begin at the beginning of April, will also be pushed out to 2 weeks later, as well as the early non-response follow-up, as well as the regular non-response follow-up. I did want to highlight the two timeline changes for service-based enumeration and the count of people experiencing homelessness outdoors. Those have been pushed back for about, it looks like roughly a month. But the plan is still for the Census Bureau to deliver the apportionment counts to the president by December 31st, and for the data to be delivered to states for the purposes of redistricting by April 21st of 2021. So knowing the timeline for all of this is key. This timeline has changed. As it is right now, enumerators will not start knocking on doors until the non-response follow-up period, which is now slated to begin for most places on May 28th. We know that this will be actually a very critical part of the operations to make sure the census counts those who didn't complete their forms before May 28th and by August 14th. So at the next slide, we have prepared a cute little infographic so that people should know what to expect if an enumerator comes to their door. What I've been told by some Census Bureau partnership specialists is that enumerators will likely come to people's homes or the homes that did not respond roughly between 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. These can actually differ depending on the regional office. So it could be 7 to 7, for instance, but that's just roughly the time period that we should expect door knockers to come. They will make multiple attempts to reach the people in the household. If they don't reach the household, then they could ask neighbors or the landlord information about that household, which can feel very invasive. So if a household responds during the non-response follow-up period, that address should be removed from the visit list in real time. And households can respond to the census online until August 14th. We definitely need to make sure that people know that a census taker will be outfitted with an ID to indicate that they work for the Bureau, and they'll have a bag or a laptop with the Census Bureau logo, and they'll also have a letter indicating that they are with the Bureau. You can also confirm that they are in fact a Census Bureau employee by contacting the Regional Census Center for your area. The regional census offices they have standard bank hours, so they, I believe, are open from 8 to 5. So if an enumerator comes at, say, 7 o'clock in the evening and you still want to confirm that that person is an employee, you can tell that person, I would like to check if you are actually an employee, so if you can come back tomorrow after I've had the chance to confirm. So that is something that that we would advise folks to do if that's something that you're concerned about. We also want to make sure that that people know that the census taker will not ask for any information other than what is already on the census form. So they will not ask for your driver's license information, your social security number, any credit card or bank information. They will not ask for money, and they will not ask for any PIN codes or passwords. Really what's important about this, though, is that we need to keep encouraging our communities to respond online by phone or by mail through August 14th. But to avoid any chance of an enumerator coming to your door, people should respond by May 28th. So because of the COVID-19 restrictions and how much they've limited our ability to conduct our usual community outreach tactics, organizations have had to come up with alternatives to reach, educate, and organize their communities to participate. And I have the privilege of being able to work with really amazing organizations across the state of California. So I'm going to share some of examples and best practices that you can adapt in your own respective communities. So the first alternative tactic is basically, use social media or use the tech that we have as stand-ins for face-to-face meetings. So for the hard to count communities that because a lot of times folks live in the same apartment buildings or they live in the same areas, right? And so one organization in the Bay Area called Asian Refugees United is going to be hosting Zoom meetings to recruit and train leaders who live in those buildings so that they're equipped to conduct census presentations or do door knocking for their neighbors. Because their neighbors know them already and or they speak the same language, there's both trust and access to these hard to count populations. So if your communities or the communities you're outreaching to have similar conditions, then I think that would be an excellent alternative for you to do your recruitment and training. So for the next slide, a lot of organizations are pivoting to figuring out how to best utilize ethnic and or social media ad buys. So a lot of organizations were already planning on doing earned media, but this is actually if there are contingency funds available, many organizations are actually identifying the different platforms that hard to count communities consume, where they consume media and programming. So it's important to identify which age groups within these ethnic populations use which platforms. You can purchase ads if possible, and if there are no ads, then identify influencers who have a large number of followers and get them on board to promote census participation. So my organization, Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, as well as AAPI's for Civic Empowerment Education Fund, are exploring these as alternatives. So we're looking at just examples of the feedback that I've gotten from many of the organizations that I've spoken to, is that Facebook is a good platform for older generations of the Lao, Filipino, Vietnamese, Nepalese, Bhutanese, and South Asian communities. YouTube is particularly good for folks that speak Khmer or Lao, and some for faith-based communities, Korean churches in the Bay Area have started live streaming church services. I'm also seeing that that's becoming more of a thing. So exploring that as a possibility would also be good. And then for Instagram, younger generations generally, but specifically with the Punjabi and Filipino communities. So for the next slide, we also want to look at creating targeted content. So there is a regional Filipino complete count committee in the Bay Area, and they are producing neighborhood, so one of the member organizations is producing neighborhood PSAs for their target community, and that particular target community is Filipino American seniors. And another organization within that complete count committee created an Instagram filter for target communities, and in that case, it's targeting Filipino American college students. So I've provided logos and also for the PowerPoint presentations, when you see them, there are actually links to these different organizations so that you can look to see what they've done or reach out to them if you have any questions or want to share best practices with them. The next slide goes into some basic peer-to-peer sharing. So just beyond looking at these platforms, there are many community members, specifically from those communities where there's no robust ethnic media presence or limited ethnic media presence. And so they continue to rely on sharing social media content at a peer-to-peer level. And we really shouldn't underestimate or overlook this. So there's some factors to consider. Are we creating content that is accessible to hard to count populations? And is information geared towards community members that may have low literacy rates in their own native language? So those are kind of key critical things to just bear in mind, regardless of the way that you're sharing this information. But I think it particularly is would apply for a lot of the communities that still rely on peer-to-peer sharing. So the organizations that are utilizing will be utilizing this more as a tactic are Asian Health Services, APEN, which is the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, the Burma Refugee Family Network, and the Hindu American Foundation. In the next slide, so there are a number of organizations that will be organizing phone banks to get out the count. And a lot of this is very similar to the way that standard get out the vote operations run. So there generally is organizations will use phone banking based from a list of registered voters. And they will use that to identify individuals that have, so they'll have the conversations with individuals and identify the ones who have committed to completing their census forms. And then subsequent to that, the follow-up is through text banking to make sure that those people actually did in fact fill out their forms. So some factors to consider around this is that these are limited to registered voters. And so these two organizations, so again, it's APEN, but there's another organization called VietRise, which is based in Orange County, California, and they've been doing phenomenal work with getting out the vote for the Vietnamese community in Orange County. So these two organizations also encounter folks that either cannot or will not or are not able to register to vote, and so there needs to so they have plans in place to identify those people as not necessarily voters, but people that they should also be contacting for a Get Out the Count campaign. So the next slide, this is going to be an interesting exercise I would love to watch or witness, is that some organizations are hosting phone or online questionnaire assistance sessions. So in place of the questionnaire assistance centers, which we obviously can't hold right now, organizations will be hosting phone or online sessions to assist their community members in completing their forms. And there are 3 organizations that will be doing this, all 3 up in the Bay Area. They're Asian Health Services, and there's also the ICANN and Vivo. It's an International Children Action Network, and I believe it's Viet Voluntary Foundation. Yeah, I feel like that is going to be one of the more interesting exercises, and hopefully I wish them the best of luck, and I want to support them in that. And then the final example that I have is around entering into strategic partnerships. So there are a lot of organizations right now that are hosting or organizing, 2020 census, essay, poetry, photo, art contests, and it's a way to try to drum up or just like highlight or educate folks about, educate youth about the census through these contests. But because of this our current COVID-19 situation, where a lot of students are in distance learning, it's actually an opportune time to approach schools or like the various institutions within the schools about entering into a partnership for these essay contests, so that it can be a way, with the schools closed, like this is a good time for students to learn about the census, and for teachers to teach them about the census and give them either course credit or extra credit for entering into contests organized by the CBOs. And so this will provide, I think, more gravity to these contests, but it's also a way, I think it's a really interesting moment for us to learn about why the census is important, and why we need an accurate count to ensure that we have adequate emergency services for our communities. And so this is just a list of the educational institutions or entities that you should be reaching out to if you want to explore this. So you can either reach out to any or all of these, the teachers union at the school, your neighboring school, individual teachers that you already might have some relationship with, the school administration, the school district, or the district superintendent. So I've actually already got some bites from the LA County Office of Education about how we can engage in a partnership like this to drum up more knowledge and encourage participation in the census. So those are the examples that I have, and hopefully these are things that you can try to implement in your own communities. Thank you.
And thank you so much for that information. Next, I want to introduce Amy with the Chinese American Planning Council.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Amy Torres. My pronouns are they and she, and I am, as introduced, the Director of Policy at the Chinese American Planning Council, CPC. I'd love to tell you a little bit about CPC first, just to situate the work that we do, and then talk about what we've been doing to both modify our services and modify our census outreach as well. So CPC, we are a social services organization that believes in social change. We serve over 60,000 low-income immigrant and Asian American and Pacific Islander New Yorkers each year. And we do that through 3 program areas: education, family support, and community and economic empowerment. Next slide, please. So through these 3 pillars, CPC is able to reach around 8,000 New Yorkers each day, whether that's after school programming, daycare services, English language classes, citizenship and naturalization, other immigrant legal services and support, as well as health services, workforce development, youth development, and senior services. We span a full spectrum of ages, multi-generational services, and the idea is that anyone could walk into any one of CPC's sites and receive services for the full family. And CPC believes strongly that the right social services can incite social change. On the next slide. We have been deeply rooted in our communities for over 55 years. We were formed in direct response to the end of the Chinese exclusion years, the same year as the Immigration and Naturalization Act, just after the Civil Rights Act. And we, again, believe that with the right services, the right support, we can really promote social and economic empowerment that has a long-term sustained movement in our communities. The next slide, please. So our social services and social change work goes hand in hand, whether it's providing after school programming, whether it's workshops, whether it's classes with our seniors, meal provision. We layer our social change work on top of all of those reaches with the community. On the next slide, please. We do this through a series of annual surveys. So we issue a staff-wide survey where staff are able to give feedback on social issues that impact them as individuals, because we know that across our 700 staff, many of us come from the very same communities that we serve. So what impacts the community impacts us, impacts our families. So we respond to the survey with social issues that are important to us, as well as social issues that are important to the community members that we work with, because for those that are working with young kids or those that are working with seniors, sometimes those issues vary and could be different. We try to make sure that these surveys remain anonymous, and then we also offer incentives as well. So we make sure that as many folks fill them out as possible. And from this survey, we form CPC's city, state, and federal policy agendas. If we could go to the next slide, please. And we take all of the feedback from these surveys and then reflect it back to both our colleagues and community members, whether that's through in-person issue forums, whether it's facilitating conversations between young people and their parents. It may be webinars, it may be staff trainings, it may be, scripting exercises so that we can talk about changing federal policies and how they relate to our communities on the ground. And then we also do civic engagement as well. On the next slide. And really encouraging all members of our communities to be civic participants, not just in voting, but in building their experience and interacting with and advocating for themselves with civic systems. So that may be call-in campaigns. We use New York City's 311 line to leave messages for the mayor or messages for city council, which is an advocacy activity that anyone can do regardless of immigration status, regardless of their tenure here in the United States. We also do voter education and outreach, and we really try to instill confidence back into the community and identify people who can be leaders on behalf of their families, on behalf of their communities, to enact that social change. And then the next slide. So once we start building these issue forums, sustaining conversations, getting people to practice, civic participation in their day-to-day lives, we also do annual advocacy events. We do a city advocacy day where we bring staff and community members down to City Hall. We meet with legislators. We talk through policy issues that are important to CPC. And then we do the same at the state capitol in Albany, and have the same experience there, talking with state senators, state assembly members. And so I've included a picture on this slide. It's one of my favorite CPC pictures of some of our staff and our president and CEO strangling one of our state senators with our policy agenda. And really the goal of all of the work that we're doing is really breaking down these barriers and demystifying the political process for everyone involved. We think, in addition to all of the systemic barriers that keep our communities from being fully represented and fully heard, we also want to make sure that people understand that elected officials, policymakers, decision makers, they work for us. And so making sure that each of these events is fun, is a low lift activity, and is really something that people can replicate in their own lives. So as CPC has been doing this work, we started participating more actively in census work with the addition of, well, actually it predated the addition of the citizenship question. When we were looking at federal funding levels, we knew that CPC, which had been designated a questionnaire assistance center in the past, was very unlikely to receive that same level of federal support for 2020. So we became active in a few campaigns, most notably New York Counts 2020, which is a statewide coalition to advocate for city and state public funding to do community-based outreach. And then soon after we joined those coalitions and after those campaigns became active was when we saw the addition of the citizenship question. So we were active in mobilizing all of the other levers that we already use, whether it's the issue forums, whether it's our civic engagement and education or our advocacy events, to upskill both staff and community members to talk about the census in a way that really resonated with them and resonated with the community. So understanding the citizenship question meant, understanding the importance of the census, all of the touches that it has on our daily lives, and really understanding that the addition of that question was intentionally designed to suppress responses and then ultimately suppress our representation and our receipt of resources. So we were able to, again, leverage a lot of those existing mechanisms. And while we were extremely excited to have wins in both the removal of the question as well as inclusion at historic levels in city and state budgets for census outreach, we felt like it was going to be a great census year, and then COVID-19 happened. So next slide. So I first want to acknowledge, as exciting as it is to finally be at April 1st, 2020, I know this is a really difficult time for those of us who, may have been facing job insecurity, maybe working with communities that are directly impacted, either in terms of their own health or their financial health. And it really weighs heavily on us, CPC, as a social services organization, to talk about something like the census on the same day that things like rent is due, mortgage payments are due, all of these bills are due for our community members. So I think just, framing and setting that space is really important, both today and in our work going forward. On March 20th, Governor Cuomo announced the New York on Pause Directive, which is a closure of all but essential services. So that the state was sheltering in place, including a closure of schools. So that meant that CPC across our 35 sites was also closed except our all but essential services. So all of those after school programs, those senior centers, those youth and workforce development sites, those all closed, but CPC does remain open. We've been modifying services as staff are remote to continue to be responsive to the community. We've continued our essential services, which are things like meal delivery. Our case management and counseling has become remote and over the phone. And then we're still providing some support for after school programming and some of our other community programming by phone or by webinar. We've also modified our services in terms of the hotlines that we have. So normally our community centers have open hotlines that people can use to make appointments for any of our walk-in services or any of our legal services referrals. We've repurposed those hotlines to direct to the cell phone numbers of key staff so that we can directly respond to the community as people are calling in and asking questions. And we've been partnering with our non-English language media partners to digest some of the changes happening at the state and city level, translate them, and make sure that our local and ethnic media partners are publishing the most up-to-date and recent information. So while CPC, the majority of our sites are closed, we have modified most of them in response to COVID-19 and the New York on Pause directive. That has also meant that we need to modify our census outreach. So the next slide. So originally our plan for census work, as I imagine many others on the call had imagined their census work, was to do what CPC already does best, rely closely on our in-person outreach, the day-to-day touch that we have with the community, those deeply embedded services, and layer census awareness and education on top of them. We cannot do that right now. So what we've done is overlay as much census work as we can on the existing essential services. So when we're doing meal delivery, trying to integrate flyers as much as we can to those home delivered meals. When we're doing outreach for our, when we're doing case management and counseling, that we're also surveying community members on whether or not they've filled out the census and trying to capture some of the attitudes or barriers that may be preventing people from filling out the census at home. It was great to hear about partners that are doing digital questionnaire assistance work. That sounds really awesome. I'm going to have to get in touch and figure out how we can do the same at CPC. But over the past 2 weeks, we've been surveying our members to ask not only what they're thinking, not only whether they're receiving the census, whether they have any questions in filling it out, but also having conversations with them about what needs they're facing. Whether it's not having a digital device at home, whether it's not being sure what the phone numbers are, or whether there are any additional hesitations or anxieties that people have about filling out the census. And there have been some silver linings as well. So we have, since we've had to modify so many of our services, we've been exploring new and different ways to interact with the community and really letting the community tell us through those phone surveys how they would like to interact with CPC staff during the New York on Pause period. Because we're a multi-generational organization, we've been relying really heavily on the parts of our community that are very online already. So our young people, our youth have told us that the way they want to stay in touch with us is through gaming platforms and online, gaming chat platforms. I myself am not a gamer, and I I'm not that old, but I feel extremely old talking about it. But we've been hearing from our youth that platforms like Twitch and Discord is already where they're spending a lot of time, and where they're spending even more time now with COVID-19. And they've been thinking through with us how we can have continued conversations with them through those platforms. For our after-school programs, our public school system has moved online as well. So we know that parents are also using Zoom, they're using personal tablets, personal computers, so that their children can go to school remotely. We've been doing the same with our after-school programming as well. So making sure that we're continuing to provide programming and activities for young children online. And really, just as we would in a normal circumstance, embedding census work into those interactions too. So if we're doing a lesson on numeracy, we're doing it online now, and we're also talking about census at the same time. And then last is we're focusing a lot of our efforts on texting out the count. So New York City has a pretty robust text out the count and phone banking campaign, which is led by our NYC Census office. We know that a lot of our community members are not big on texting, because we serve low income and immigrant communities. We know that people don't always have unlimited text plans. They may not be comfortable responding by text, and they may not be reading text messages that are sent to them in English. But we know that we are limited in our capacity to do the work that we do best, which is that in-person outreach. So we've been continuing to text the public with the hope that we, once we come out of this quarantine period, that we can confidently pivot away from the folks that we know are easy to target, the people that we know are easy to motivate and convince to self-respond. And once we do come out of this quarantine period, in what we hope is late spring or early summer, that we can laser focus our efforts back into the work that we do really well, into the hardest to reach and the hardest to count communities, and sort of confidently pivot away from some of the easier targets that can be motivated through texting out the count. So we would love to hear from, I know other panelists have things to share as well. On the next slide is CPC's website, and you can follow us on any of our social handles. We would really love to uplift the work that you're doing as well, and continue to be a resource and a partner to the other coalitions and networks that we work in. And thank you very much for your time.
Amy, thank you for sharing the shifts and adjustments that CPC has had to make, and sharing your guidance for all of the organizations and partners who are dealing with the same situation. I will turn it over to our next speaker, Sina, with Empowering Pacific Islander Communities.
Thanks, Bessie. Hi, everyone. My name is Sina Weepy. I'm the Policy Associate for EPIC, also known as Empowering Pacific Islander Communities. We're a national organization based in Los Angeles, but I'm actually the DC-based staff. We focus on leadership development, research, advocacy, and policy for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders on the continent. Census and civic engagement are two big components that we're focusing on this year, in addition to policy issues pertaining to education, health, and immigration. In the coming months, we'll eventually transition from our census work to voter registration with the partners that we have across the country. And I also want to note that EPIC is a member of NCAPA, which is the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, a coalition of 35 AAPI organizations, national organizations, and we just became a member last year in 2019. Next slide. So just to give you some historical context on how we got to this point of making sure that NHPIs are included in the census, there's definitely been effort and work put in from many of our leaders even before 2000. In 1995, NHPI leaders from California, Hawaii, and Utah were invited and appointed by the Census Bureau to be a part of the Racial Ethnic Advisory Committee to meet quarterly and also address the issues regarding advocacy for disaggregated NHPI community data. Before this, historically, we've always been grouped with Asian Americans in the census, and so this was a huge deal for our community to make sure that we have data for disaggregated data on our community so that we can better understand and see the needs that that we can help inform not only our community but also our leaders at the local level and at the national level as well. In 2000 was when it was the first time NHPIs had our own category in the census. And so that's when we started to see media outreach that included community images of Pacific Islanders. And so the Native Hawaiian, Samoan, Chamorro, and other Pacific Islander category was a part of the 2000 census. And still is up until now. In 2010, AAPI and NHPI community organizations worked together to create more materials. So as you can see, each decade, everything was kind of building and growing to make sure that we had in-language materials, more photos that were representative of our community members, and yeah, like I said, in-language flyers and fact sheets like that. There's a huge part of our community that their first language is not English, so this is why it's always been really important for us. And then EPIC had worked with AAJ-LA to develop 2 demographic reports, one for California and one for just the US as a whole. And that was released in 2014, which was based on the 2010 census. I want to note too that EPIC is, I think we're like 10 years old right now. And so the census is like in our organizational DNA. So it's really, really important work for us to do and to continue to do. Let's see, next slide. So I just wanted to uplift 2 of these elders in our community, Cowan Young and Lono Collars, who have been leaders and advocates in our community, both at the local and the national level, leading up to 2000 and even 2000 and even post 2000. I think Cowan Young is actually going to speak at the NCAPA Census Day virtual rally later. So it's really important for us to make sure that we include our elders and our leaders before and continue to seek their guidance and support because they're still doing this work with us. Next slide. So as far as outreach and efforts that we've done in preparation for 2020 census, we've partnered with AAJC, and then we also have partners, Pacific Islander partners in Arkansas, California, Oregon, Utah, and Washington. And with AAJC, we did message testing in these different parts of the country with our own community to see what the needs were, and what census outreach could potentially look like for our own community. We created a website which is hosted under the Count Us In 2020 website, and it's just the www.countusin2020.org/NHPI. And so there you'll find multiple resources just for our community. There's both in-language resources and also just general resources that are in English as well. The materials that were developed as far as the in-language fact sheets and PSAs, that was based on the feedback as well. And we found that it was important to include as many languages as possible because this was never done before. So we were able to have materials translated into Chamorro, Chuukese, Marshallese, Native Hawaiian, Palauan, Samoan, Tongan, and Vakaviti, which is for the Fijian community. We also recognize the diversity that exists within the PI community with the three different groups. So there's Melanesian, Polynesian, and Micronesian. Based off of what we know about that and also the feedback that we got, we worked with our graphic designer, who is also Pacific Islander, based in LA, and he was able to, instead of just designing one, template for our fact sheets and the graphics that you see here, he developed 3 different ones representing each of those regions. So the one on your far left represents Micronesia, and the one in the middle represents Melanesia, and then the one on the right represents Polynesia. So that was really important for us. In addition to that, we worked with NHPI translators to get our materials translated into these 8 languages. We hired Pacific Islander photographers in each of these states where we have partners to attend convenings that our partners were hosting. So everything was really driven by our community, and that's pretty much our approach to our work, is we base everything off of our community's needs and asks, and it's our responsibility and our job to really uplift it and make sure that they're represented in a way that they feel heard and seen, and just really standing up for our community. Next slide. As far as shifting the strategy in the midst of COVID-19, it's definitely been a challenge for a lot of our partners. One thing I want to note is that I know obviously it's not like a normal thing for a lot of people in general to practice social distancing, but this is hitting our community pretty hard because social distancing is not a thing for us. If we're not at home with our own families, we're with groups of friends, or at church with our church community, or just we're always just really around a bunch of our closest friends and loved ones. And so this is, a lot of our partners had planned in-person workshops and faith-based outreach leading up to Census Day and even afterwards, but it was all it all had to shift kind of abruptly because of COVID-19. And so in addition to really pushing out our resources on the website, it seems like we're just doing it more on a more bigger scale now, and our partners are also helping us with that as well. We're really focusing on social media because that's where we have a lot of reach through Instagram with a lot of young Pacific Islanders. And so we've decided to, we just launched a Census raffle that will be raffling off gift cards once a week until the end of this month. And it's just a way for our community to get engaged and to make it fun. I think when it comes to things like census or any, other issue, whether it's voter engagement or talking about specific policy issues, it's not always, you have to approach it in a way where our community is going to understand and want to learn, instead of just kind of throwing these, these things at them. And so we're very strategic and intentional about our approach. And so we just launched our raffle contest in which we reached out to several Pacific Islander influencers, and we're continuing to reach out to them. We've made a list of a number of them, and some of them have already shared out this contest. And then another example is I was actually invited to speak on a local Tongan radio show that's hosted weekly in Utah this past Sunday. And I thought it was a great opportunity to really speak to the Tongan community specifically, because there's still a lot of information out there that people are kind of confused about or not sure of, and especially when it comes to the citizenship question. So it was good to have people tell us, like, thank you for clearing that up for us. That was really helpful, and to really engage participation. I think it's also really important to note that, our community is more likely to participate when they see someone from the community, represented in spaces we're typically not represented in. I've heard some of the other speakers talk about other strategies as far as phone banking. That's one of our partners is planning to do that as well. Our partner in Seattle, Washington, I know that they were going to have some sort of TikTok contest to focus on, get the young people more engaged, and to help their parents and grandparents fill out the census form. We're doing a lot of our outreach, again, like I said, on social media through Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Some of our partners are just having like Instagram lives or Facebook lives, talking about the census and how to fill out the form. And these hashtags that I have here are hashtags that we've been using consistently since we've started our whole census campaign. In addition, when we post our graphics and our infographics and our photos as well. We've gotten pretty good feedback from our community about the materials that we've developed so far. And it's been a collective effort, and I really want to acknowledge, a lot of our partners who are on the ground in the states that I've named, who are doing a lot of the work and really trying to reach out to our community, even now with the challenge of COVID-19. I think that's it. That's what I have for now. But if there's any questions, I know one thing that's been working for us and our partners is we're checking in more frequently. We actually have a call tomorrow with our national partners just to check in and see where everyone is at, and what support is needed, and how we can best uplift that through social media and through just media as well. I forgot to note that we're constantly adding to our website as well. We also have a social media toolkit that we developed using these template designs and graphics. And we've made the blank ones available for our community to even create their own. And then again, just referring back to local radio, and then podcasts and webinars that a lot of our other partners have participated in. Like we've asked for their permission to include it on our website so that everything is just kind of like on one page or one site that everyone can go to. And also I want to point out that NCAPA has a AAPI #AAPI 2020 census team through the Civic Engagement and Communications Committee, where EPIC is also plugged into those committees as well to make sure there's NHPI content for our community. And we've also been pushing that out as well. And so, yeah, I think that's it on my end.
Sina, thank you, and thanks for sharing the incredible wealth of resources that you all have been producing, especially the translated resources. For those of you who are interested in joining the virtual rally that Sina had mentioned, it's taking place in just an hour at 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central, 4 p.m. Mountain, 3 p.m. Pacific, and 12 p.m. Hawaii time. And you can RSVP at bit.ly/AAPI 2020 virtual rally. Again, that's bit.ly/AAPI 2020 virtual rally. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to our final speakers, Soumya and Jessica with Asian Counseling and Referral Service in Washington.
Hi, thank you, Bessie. This is Jessica Valdez. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the project specialist with ACRS. I'm going to kick it off for us, and then Soumya will follow up with some additional comments. But if, ACRS, we are based in Seattle, Washington. Our work is really centered on providing health and social services to API communities, primarily in King County, but also in parts of Snohomish and Pierce counties. And part of our services is incorporating civic engagement focused work. So if you can proceed to the next slide. So ACRS, we have been working with over 20 community-based partner organizations across Washington state to provide census outreach and support to API, immigrant, refugee, and other historically undercounted communities. And I think like what folks have already been mentioning, pre-COVID-19, a lot of our strategies have been focused on deploying trusted messengers into the communities we serve to provide complete and accurate information on the census in the languages spoken by these communities, on top of the media-based, the phone-based, and the text-based outreach. So some of our strategies included having a presence at large cultural and community gatherings, integrating reminders and education about the census during regularly scheduled programs like our classes or check-ins with our clients, having trained the trainers, having presentations with youth and adults on the census, and then providing questionnaire assistance sites with volunteer support, as well as working with small businesses in our areas, property managers, student and faculty groups, and other community leaders whom our communities rely on to get trusted information on the census and on things in general. Currently, Washington State is also in a stay-home order. So aside from essential services and other exceptions, majority of Washingtonians have to remain at home. So of course, this has been a huge impact on the planning and the work that we were hoping to do around census. So if you can advance to the next slide. So I'll quickly go over some challenges for ACRS, and I think for many of our partners as well. Our capacity has had to shift towards prioritizing essential services, focusing on mitigating and responding to COVID-19, and really on supporting our communities with meeting their urgent needs in this time. And so within that, we've been faced with the challenge of figuring out how to balance the urgency of supporting our community's basic needs amidst COVID-19 with the urgency to ensure that they're counted in the census. Some of our partners we've been hearing just have not had capacity to hold both, and so that's been a hard thing for them to hold in this time. And within that as well, we're recognizing a need to meet our communities where they are emotionally as COVID develops day to day. An example I can share is we were text banking for challenge ballots recently, and many of the folks that we reached out to just straight up said that this was not a concern to them because of the pandemic. And so that really just told us that for many of our communities are not ready to talk about the census right now. The COVID-19 situation is much more visible and is much more pressing. And so with the developments of COVID-19 day to day, we've been trying to figure out how to navigate sharing information and updates with our communities in ways that are sensitive and linguistically accessible, and also accessible in general to them, both on COVID-19 and on the census. we at ACRS, and I think many of our partners, have been just swamped recently with updates and info on both COVID and census. And so it's taken us, it's required us having to think through how to not overwhelm our communities as the trusted messengers, and how to best support with multiple urgent matters going on. Yeah, and so we've been just trying to figure out how to pivot our strategies to be accessible and as meaningful as possible to our communities while adhering to this stay home order. And then I think I'm going to pass it off to Shomia to talk more about what opportunities we have been trying to incorporate in this current time.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, so I think that at ACRS, we wanted to focus our conversation a little bit about, like, more so on census and COVID, because I mean, this is the reality of our situation now. And I think, you know, working within this partner network of folks around Washington State that are working amongst, like, the diversity of our communities, that are working both in rural communities and, like, highly dense communities like King County, we're kind of, like, hearing, I think, all those concerns around COVID and census at the same time. And so it's hard to even think back, like, a month ago about what we thought our strategy was, because our reality is just, like, completely shifted. And it's hard to think about, you know, census work, like, I wrote opportunities, but it's hard to think about what is currently happening as opportunities. But I think the way that I think about that is that I think organizing in communities of color is inherently about being responsive and about being flexible. And I think that's, like, what we're seeing right now. And so, like most folks, I mean, I don't want to be too redundant, but like most folks here, the ways that we have shifted is also very phone-based. I think we're trying to keep essential to that one-to-one organizing, where we are doing this peer-based model, but switching it instead of in person to phone and text banking. Of course, there are limitations of that because of the voter activation network. There's lots of folks on there. I mean, the only folks that are on there are registered voters and citizens. So there are gaps in our community, but we've seen even people, organizations in our partner network, do phone banking just through, like, their own list of, like, for example, the Indian Association of Western Washington, they do phone banking. It's just through their network of people and their clients. And so some people are utilizing phone banking past just, like, what we normally talk about it as, like, the van, for example. Similarly, we are also trying to put info cards and information around the census with our food deliveries. I mean, Asian Counseling and Referral Services is also a social services agency doing food deliveries and keeping essential services in their time. So I think trying to figure out how we can also package census information into some of those essential services like food deliveries. We're looking to collaborate with grocery stores and hit up H-Marts and other stores that are on the south side of King County, where our AAPI communities predominantly live, and hopefully putting up, like, census information at the grocery stores, since we know that's where folks go during this time. I think Epic just talked about doing incentives. One of our groups, the Hmong Association of Washington, is doing an incentive-based thing, just also through their, like, network of whoever can take a picture with their census form and send it in enters into a raffle for an incentive. And so to think of, like, games and fun ways to get people involved, I think is also really crucial and also important in this time when gift cards and to grocery stores and incentives like that can actually be very impactful in people's lives. And so trying to integrate that into census opportunities. Another thing that we've been doing is just thinking really specifically about if we're moving people to fill the census online, and that is something that we're highly trying to promote, like, what are the digital literacy gaps for our communities? And so right now we're even just, like, creating screenshot by screenshot guides on how to fill out the census online, because we know for an organization like ACRS, where most of our population is limited English proficient, is often seniors and elders and folks that have limited literacy, both digitally and otherwise. How can we create something with pictures, with something that is as simple as possible, that is more than just visit 2020census.gov. And then likewise, I think we're also just trying to use this opportunity where everybody's working virtually to engage our volunteers in things like text banking, both because we need to increase our capacity, but also I think just generally peer-to-peer organizing. If you engage your volunteers, they're more likely to tell their friends and family who are also a PI about the census. And if you could go to the next slide, please. And I think these are just some of the best practices that we picked up. I mean, I highly want to recognize that all of us are just trying to figure this out. I mean, we've never done census organizing through a pandemic. I personally have never lived through a pandemic like this before. So I think like this is all just something that we are trying to figure out together. Some of the things that we've heard both from our organizations and figured ourselves is what Jessica already talked about, being responsive to community needs. This is not the time to push census messaging more and more and more. It's time to listen to our folks and figure out how we can meet them where they're at when there's other things that are urgent to them. We want to think about our gaps as specifically as possible, similar to how I was talking about the step-by-step guide of digital literacy. What are the exact gaps between our specific demographic of folks and them filling out the census? What are the gaps that exist, and where do we have capacity in this pandemic to fill those gaps? We want to continue to use data and to figure out where our communities are filling out the census. Is it in the Yakima Valley? Is it in other rural places that they're not filling it out? Or is it right here in South King County? And how can we target outreach through that? And then we just want to also make sure that when we are doing our census outreach and messaging, that we are tying COVID to it, not in a superficial way, but in a way that shows that actually our emergency state funding, our access to Medicaid is deeply rooted in the conditions set by the census and a complete count. And then additionally, I think for some of us who are working highly locally, how can we use the opportunity? How can we use what's currently happening around us that were once like census coalitions to now organize around long-term advocacy for needs for a community, whether they be a rent moratorium or they advocate for more phone languages for our census phone lines, or anything vice versa that is related to like justice for our communities? How do we use this moment to build long-term infrastructure based off of what was once completing the census form? So yeah, and that's all I have.
Thank you. So I think that all of our speakers really touched on important things: being responsive, being flexible, and most of all, being creative. There clearly is not a one-size-fits-all approach to continuing your get out the count work during COVID-19. And all of our speakers have shared today a lot of the great strategies and adjustments that they're making, especially while juggling a lot of different areas of work that aren't focused on the census. One resource that I did want to lift up in regards to targeting your outreach is the City University of New York's hard to count map. It can be found at Census Hard to Count Maps 2020.us, and it's being updated daily with self-response rates. And there's also a weekly analysis that's being released by the Census Counts Coalition. So it's been a really great resource for folks who are looking to figure out where exactly to target outreach during this time. We are going to move to Q&A, and I will turn it over to my colleague Rima, who will facilitate Q&A.
Thanks, Bessie, and thank you to all our speakers for sharing your wealth of information. For a Q&A portion, you can either type in your questions into the questions box, and I can read them out loud to our speakers, or you can ask to be unmuted, and I'll unmute you, and you can directly talk to our speakers yourself. All right. So the first question we have is from Jeremy. His question is, when confirming an enumerator, what information will we need to provide? Would it just be their name and ID badge number? And I feel like you would answer this best.
Yes, yes. So you basically would just need to ask them for their name, and I actually the name should actually be sufficient, but if you want to be thorough, then ask for any additional information. But my understanding is that a name itself should be fine.
Great. And then we have a couple people who will be unmuted. So Lynn, I will be unmuting you first. Lynn, are you able to unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. This is a really great webinar. Very useful information and very timely too. And I was very interested in knowing a little bit more about some of the activities that you share, particularly like raffle, ticket kind of activities. I would think that may be able to kind of stimulate some activities there among all of our trusted messengers, because everybody right now in Washington State really is staying at home on this absolutely essential activities such as going out shopping. So I'm thinking something like that could work. I was just wondering if you have a little bit more specific about that you can share. Thank you.
Hi, this is Sina. I know since we're doing a raffle contest right now, and we just launched it last week, it's really just, and I don't want to say that Epic is it's just Epic doing this. We're doing this in partnership with one of our partners in California, in the Bay Area. So it's been helpful to do this, as a partnership with folks that we've been working on this with to do this contest. We just came up, Epic staff and our partner put together just like a work plan of what we thought this could look like, and then we developed these graphics that I showed you, and just came up with the rules and like how to enter, and remembering to add the hashtag. And also what we're doing with that is, in addition to reaching out to our the influencers, we're having them drive traffic to our page, to our Instagram. So both our Instagram and our partner PCRC, their Instagram as well, because we both have the same posts. So it's easier for us to track and to also track the hashtags as well, of people who are participating. And so at this point, it's really just continuing to push out the information about our contest consistently, and continuing to reach out to more influencers, because we reached out to a good amount already who shared our posts and information about our contest, but we still have a lot more folks to reach out to, and just being really consistent with it, especially with everyone being online these days.
Great, Sina, thank you. And we'll take one last question from Denny De La Rosa. Len, you've been unmuted. Hi, Lenny, are you still with us? Okay, seems like Lenny's not with us anymore. So with that, just to be mindful of everyone's time, since we've gone a little bit over, we'll be ending the webinar now, but if you have any more questions, please feel free to email our Census team at Asian Americans Advancing Justice AJC, or personally email any of our speakers that were on our panel today. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning in.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks all.